to make sure that they are able to maintain the right records. Don't you agree, Ms. Mitchell?
I agree, and I think they need to get rid of fictitious names that are on voter registration cards turned in by ACORN workers over the past several decades.
I do too. I agree.
So purging is a good thing. It cleans clean my closet, get rid of things you don't need, clean the voter rolls, get rid of names of people who don't exist, who have moved away, who have not voted. That is not a violation of civil rights. That is a protection of the integrity of every American's right to vote.
And we want to protect those who are eligible.
That's important.
Those who are eligible to vote and those who have registered, we want to make sure that they are protected and that they are not purged off the rolls. As Ms. Mitchell knows, in Florida and across the country, that has happened, and that is a fact.
Cleta Mitchell, let me ask you a question about the former U.S. Attorney General, Bertha Gonzalez. Ultimately, he was forced to quit over the scandal around the firing of U.S. attorneys. Now, that scandal...
A media-created scandal, I would say.
Now, that in the firing of these attorneys came down to these attorneys, Republican U.S. attorneys around the country, saying that they were being pressured to investigate these, what they called voter fraud cases that turned out not to be voter fraud cases, like the U.S. Attorney of New Mexico, the Republican U.S. Attorney David Iglesias, who said he was wrongfully fired because he failed to indict ACORN members for voter fraud. So this really has been going on for quite a long time, and ultimately the casualty of this was the U.S. Attorney General, because his own U.S. attorneys around the country said that the voter fraud evidence was not there, that they couldn't prosecute the cases that the Bush administration was pushing them to prosecute.
Let me tell you a little-known fact that I think is all tied up in this, and frankly, this is another thing I've testified to Congress about. I believe very strongly that this was a media-created frenzy of this whole idea of these U.S. attorneys. I'll be interested to see if President Obama keeps all the Republican U.S. attorneys and whether the media makes a big deal when he fires them all, as Janet Reno and Bill Clinton did when President Clinton took over and fired all the Bush U.S. attorneys in 1992. But let me just say this. The Justice Department has had apparently a long-standing policy of not investigating individual instances of voter fraud. That policy was changed at some point in the last 2 to 3 years to say, like any other criminal offense, if you don't investigate individual instances, you may not uncover a scheme or a concerted pattern and practice of an intent to violate the law. And so they changed the policy. ACORN, other civil rights groups have been furious at the Justice Department for changing that policy to say we will investigate these individual instances of voter fraud because that's the only way we're ever going to uncover any criminal scheme of voter fraud.
Let me just
that policy has changed, and I believe very strongly that part of this effort to pressure have been a part of the effort to say there is no voter fraud, therefore anyone who investigates it must be a racist. That's the only reason you could possibly be investigating it.
Just a clarification on the point you made, whether if Barack Obama became president, he would fire U.S. attorneys. You are correct on Clinton firing the attorneys, as Bush did when he came in. The issue wasn't when a new administration. No. The issue wasn't when a new administration comes in, whether they're entitled to fire the attorneys. It's all of these attorneys were fired midterm, not when Bush first came in. These were all the Bush appointments that they fired in after the next election. And they alleged it was because of their refusing to, though they investigated for years, prosecute these voter registration cases. But let me go to a victory for the Republican Party. A federal appeals court yesterday ordering Ohio Secretary of State Jennifer Brunner setting up a system by Friday to verify the eligibility of new voters and make the information available to the state's 88 county election boards. The 6th U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals upheld a lower court ruling that Brunner must use other government records to check new voters for fraud. We interviewed the Secretary of State, Jennifer Brunner, last week and asked her to respond to allegations of ACORN's involvement in fraudulent voter registration in Ohio.
We have things built into our law so that anytime someone registers, even if they register and vote on the same day, a notification card is sent to them at their address. If that card comes back, that certainly puts that registration into question. The poll book is marked, and if that person were to show up at the polling place, Ohio law now requires that Ohioans show ID, although our ID law is much more liberal than, for instance, Indiana's. So, and then also our boards of elections do enter those voter registration applications into a database that automatically is sent to the Secretary of State's database. We're connected with T1 lines. We run that, of course, through the Bureau of Motor Vehicles, who sends it on to the Social Security Administration if it can't get a match on driver's license. So we think there are some excellent safeguards built into the law. But our own experience with ACORN in Ohio is there have been some problems in the past, but the person who we work with when there are questions from ACORN is Katie Gall, who is very experienced and conscientious, and we've had nothing but good experiences working with her.
We also have a soundbite of the vice presidential candidate, Republican Party, Sarah Palin, on the Rush Limbaugh show. She's making accusations about ACORN and Obama financing ACORN.
Talk quickly about ACORN and the unconscionable situation that we're facing right now with voter fraud. And given the ties between Obama and ACORN and the money that his campaign has sent them and the job that he had with them in the past, Obama has a responsibility to rein in ACORN and prove that he's willing to fight voter fraud.
He's not going to do that. He's been paying for them. He's not going to rein them. This is why you guys have to have the responsibility. Obama's not going to do anything to harm himself.
And now let's turn to Senator Obama himself. He responded on Tuesday to a reporter's questions about his relationship with ACORN and charges of voter fraud.
First of all, my relationship to ACORN is pretty straightforward. It's probably 13 years ago, when I was still practicing law, I represented ACORN, and my partner in that representation was the U.S. Justice Department in having Illinois implement what was called the motor voter law to make sure that people could go to DMVs and driver's license facilities to get registered. It wasn't being implemented. That was my relationship and is my relationship to ACORN. There is an ACORN organization in Chicago. They've been active. As an elected official, I've had interactions with them, but they're not advising our campaign. We've got the best voter registration and turnout and volunteer operation in politics right now, and we don't need ACORN's help. My understanding, by the way, in terms of the voter fraud, because having run a voter registration drive, I know how problems arise. This is typically a situation where ACORN probably paid people to get registrations, and these folks, not wanting to actually register people, because that's actually hard work, just went into a phone book or made up names and submitted false registrations to get paid. So there's been fraud perpetrated on probably ACORN if they paid these individuals and they actually didn't do registrations. But this isn't a situation where there's actually people who are going to try to vote because these are phony names. It's doubtful that Tony Romo is going to show up in Ohio to vote. So this is another one of these distractions that gets stirred up during the course of a campaign. But what I want to make sure of, though, is that this is not used as an excuse for the kind of voter suppression strategies and tactics that we've seen in the past. Let's just make sure everybody is voting, everybody's registered. Let's make sure that everybody's doing it in a lawful way.
That was Senator Barack Obama. Cleta Mitchell.
Well, he can say that ACORN isn't advising his campaign. Then pray tell, why did his campaign pay an ACORN organization over $800,000 and misidentify it so as to attempt to conceal it, and was only forced by a media report to then